I'm a 29-year-old woman, and my relationship with my family, particularly my sister, has always been close though, to be honest, a little complicated. My sister Clara is only 2 years older than me, and while we've always been close, there's always been this weird tension. Like we're supportive of each other, but somehow she always seems to need to outshine me, even if it's in the smallest things. When I got a promotion, she made a point of sharing her own recent accomplishment. When I started a new hobby, she would take up something similar, just to show she could do it better. But as much as it bothered me, I'd always shrugged it off as sibling rivalry. A few months ago, I got engaged to my fiancé, Josh, who's an amazing guy, and I was over the moon. After telling him yes, I couldn't wait to share the news with my family, my parents were thrilled, of course, and Clara, well, her reaction was lukewarm. She smiled and congratulated me, but it felt off like the enthusiasm was forced. I didn't think too much of it, though. I figured maybe she was caught off guard or just had a rough day. But the strange reactions kept coming. I'd chosen a beautiful venue, a cozy, charming spot with gorgeous views and a rustic vibe. I loved it instantly. The first time I showed Clara the photos, she barely glanced at them before saying, I guess it's okay, but wouldn't you want something a bit classier? Classier? I loved this venue. It was perfect for us. She seemed disappointed when I didn't take her suggestion to look for somewhere more elegant, but I let it slide. Clara's always had a thing for fancy places, so I figured it was just her taste. After that, though, the little digs started. First, she made a big deal about my dress. I'd found the one, simple, elegant, exactly what I wanted. When I showed her a picture, she frowned and said, "Are you sure? It's pretty plain. I thought you'd go for something with more wow factor." Then it was the guest list. She kept dropping hints that I might be inviting the wrong people, or that my choices for decorations were a bit basic. It was like everything I was excited about, she felt the need to critique, gently, but just enough to make me second-guess myself. Then came the interference that actually started affecting things. I found out she had called my florist to ask about changing the order. She'd suggested they swap out the arrangements I'd chosen for something more in budget, whatever that meant. My wedding planner called, clearly confused, asking if Clara had any decision-making power for the wedding. I was stunned. Why would she go behind my back and mess with my plans? When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying she was only trying to help and that I shouldn't be so touchy. Honestly, she said, "You're turning into a bit of a bridezilla." That stung. I didn't think I was being unreasonable at all. In fact, I'd been trying to keep things low-key, but she made me feel like I was losing it. It felt like I was constantly apologizing for standing up for my own choices, even though it was my wedding. And that's when things took an even stranger turn. A few weeks later, I started hearing rumors. Nothing huge at first, just little comments here and there. A family friend mentioned that she'd heard from Clara that Josh and I were having problems with the wedding planning, which wasn't true at all. Then someone else asked if we were really sure about everything because apparently Clara had hinted we might be rushing into things. I brushed it off as more of her passive-aggressive nonsense, but when Josh himself brought it up, I realized it was serious. He'd heard from one of his own friends, someone who's close with Clara's boyfriend, that Clara was suggesting he take a closer look at my loyalty and commitment. Josh looked hurt, confused, and I felt sick to my stomach. What was she doing? Trying to address it directly, I confronted Clara, asking her outright why she was spreading rumors. She denied it immediately, acting shocked that I'd even accuse her of such a thing. She said she was only looking out for me, and that people must be twisting her words. I didn't buy it, but she doubled down, acting hurt, even teary-eyed, like I'd accused her of something terrible. Suddenly, she was the victim, just trying to help, and I was the ungrateful, paranoid sister. The breaking point came during a family gathering. I'd hoped she'd keep it together in front of everyone, but she made a pointed comment over dinner, saying, "It's normal to get cold feet, especially when things are moving so fast." Everyone's eyes turned to me, and my mom gave me that knowing, worried look. My dad changed the subject quickly, but I was seething. Clara had dropped this little seed of doubt in front of everyone, as if I was on the verge of calling off my wedding. Later, when I tried to talk to my parents about Clara's behavior, they shrugged it off as typical pre-wedding jitters on my part. "You're both just stressed. Weddings bring out the worst in everyone," my mom said. My dad added that Clara probably just felt a little left out, especially since she wasn't married yet. I felt like I was in a nightmare, completely alone in trying to manage this chaos. That night, lying awake, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Clara's behavior wasn't random. It was like she was deliberately trying to sabotage the most important day of my life. Something had to change, and I realized I couldn't count on my family to see it. I'd have to handle this on my own, and if Clara kept pushing, I was going to make sure she couldn't ruin my wedding. Update 1. Just when I thought I'd seen the worst of Clara's antics, Josh dropped a bombshell on me. He'd received a string of messages from her that started about a month ago. At first, they seemed innocent enough, just her checking in, which he thought was strange but brushed off as her being protective. But then, they took a darker turn. She'd started warning him to watch out for red flags in our relationship, even hinting that I'd been less than honest with him. Josh showed me the messages, and there it was, Clara trying to plant seeds of doubt in his mind about our relationship. After reading those messages, I felt like my blood was boiling. Who does that? I dug a little deeper, and sure enough, I found older messages where Clara had hinted that I was only with Josh for his stability and even suggested that I wasn't fully committed. She'd been planting these ideas for weeks, quietly chipping away at his trust in me. When I confronted my mom about it, hoping she'd finally see what Clara was doing, she barely reacted. She just said, "Your sister's always looked out for you in her way. She's probably just feeling a bit left out of everything." Left out? She was deliberately trying to wreck my relationship. The next day, I got a call from my wedding coordinator. She sounded confused, asking if I'd decided to adjust the floral arrangements. I hadn't changed anything, and I told her so. That's when she mentioned Clara had called, claiming she was authorized to make a few tweaks. Clara had tried to replace the flowers I'd chosen with a cheaper option. I couldn't believe it. She'd actually tried to alter my wedding plans, again. I told the coordinator firmly that Clara had no authority to change anything, and to notify me immediately if she tried it again. I realized then that my sister's interference was more than just annoying, it was deliberate. Not wanting to rely on just my own experience, I reached out to a few close friends to see if anyone else had noticed her behavior. Turns out, several of them had heard things. One friend mentioned that Clara had hinted our wedding budget was over the top and questioned if Josh could even afford it. Another friend had overheard her mentioning that Josh might not be around much longer if he found out about my past. None of it was true, of course, but Clara had clearly been planting these little ideas wherever she could, hoping they'd spread. That's when I realized this wasn't about me or Josh, it was about her trying to ruin something I cared about. I knew I had to confront Clara directly. I couldn't let her keep weaving these lies, so I went over to her place, determined to get an explanation. When I brought up everything I'd found, the messages to Josh, her attempt to change the flower arrangements, the rumors she'd been spreading, she looked at me like I was crazy. She denied everything, saying I was just overly sensitive and paranoid. When I showed her the messages, she waved them off as jokes, claiming I'd misunderstood her humor. But there was nothing funny about what she'd done. I'd had enough. That night, Josh and I sat down and talked about Clara's constant interference. Frustrated and fed up, he suggested we start recording any future interactions with her, just in case. He didn't want to let her ruin our relationship, but we both agreed that we needed evidence if she pulled something like this again. I decided that if she continued to interfere, I'd have the proof I needed to show my family and anyone else who still thought I was overreacting. Still, I wanted my parents to understand what was really happening, so I brought them the evidence. They barely looked at it before shrugging it off as sibling issues. My mom brushed it aside, saying this is just how Clara is. She's always had a bit of a sharp edge, but she loves you. It was infuriating. No matter what Clara did, my parents seemed willing to excuse it. I realized then that I was on my own with this. Finally, needing someone to talk to who could offer an objective view, I booked a session with a therapist. After listening to everything, she validated what I'd been feeling and encouraged me to set boundaries. She also suggested documenting everything from now on. That's when it hit me. I didn't need to play nice anymore. I start keeping records of every incident, every message, every attempt at sabotage. If Clara was determined to ruin my wedding, I was just as determined to protect it. To make it clear that things were different, I quietly unfollowed her on social media. It was a small move, but for me it was a line in the sand. If she wanted to mess with my wedding, she'd have to do it without access to any updates or plans I posted. It was my way of signaling that I wasn't going to keep her in my life if she kept trying to ruin it. This wasn't how I imagined planning my wedding would go. Instead of picking out flowers and finalizing seating charts, I was dealing with a sister who seemed set on turning everything upside down. But now I knew the extent she'd go to, and I wasn't going to let her win. Update 2. The day of the wedding finally arrived, and everything seemed to be falling into place. The venue looked perfect, the flowers were arranged just as I'd envisioned, and Josh and I were ready to walk down the aisle. But of course, Clara had other plans. Clara arrived almost an hour late, just as the guests were being seated. She swept in wearing a dress that looked strikingly similar to mine. I had chosen a simple but elegant ivory gown, and somehow, she'd managed to find a white, floor-length dress with a similar lace bodice. People noticed. I saw the confused glances from our family, and a few friends shot me sympathetic looks. It was obvious, yet Clara acted like it was completely normal. Then came the seating chaos. I had carefully planned out the seating arrangements, making sure family and friends were comfortably placed. But as I was mingling with guests before the ceremony, I started hearing murmurs of confusion about seating. Somehow, people were sitting in the wrong places. My aunt mentioned she'd found her place card swapped, and soon enough, I saw that nearly every place card had been moved. When I confronted the coordinator, she told me Clara had offered to help with last-minute details. She'd gone around, subtly rearranging everything. Minutes before the ceremony, Josh's groomsmen rushed over to find me, looking serious. He explained that Clara had pulled Josh aside, saying I was having a breakdown and was considering calling off the wedding. Apparently, she had told him I was panicking and wanted to talk to him before we proceeded. Josh thankfully didn't buy it. He stayed calm, brushed her off, and asked one of his groomsmen to stay close by in case she tried to stir up anything else. During the ceremony itself, things went smoothly at first. Then, as I was reciting my vows, I heard Clara's voice loud and clear. She corrected me on a word I'd said, claiming it was an inside joke. The moment froze, and I could feel every eye shift from me to her. I continued, forcing a smile, while Clara sat there, smirking. The photographer caught the whole thing on video, capturing every one of her annoyed glances, eye rolls, and disapproving expressions throughout the ceremony. As if that wasn't enough, when the ceremony ended, Clara insisted on giving an impromptu speech. We hadn't planned on speeches from anyone outside of our wedding party, but before anyone could stop her, she grabbed the microphone. She started with a forced, syrupy sweet congratulations, then quickly shifted to embarrassing stories from my past. She brought up random, irrelevant things from high school, times I'd been clumsy, even hinting at an old boyfriend who'd once shown up at my parents' house unexpectedly. Guests looked visibly uncomfortable, and a few excused themselves from the area. Josh's parents looked horrified. After the speech, I slipped away to the bathroom to collect myself, and as I was touching up my makeup, Clara strolled in. Without a hint of remorse, she made a snide comment about how not all marriages last and how she hoped I'd at least make it to our first anniversary. I was stunned, standing there in my wedding dress while she casually tore down the day I'd spent months planning. At that moment, Josh entered the bathroom, having overheard her. He stood there, visibly angry, and told her that if she didn't leave us alone, he'd have her escorted out. The rest of the evening continued with guests quietly checking in on me, asking if everything was okay with Clara. They'd all noticed her erratic behavior. I kept a smile on my face, determined to enjoy what was left of our day, but each interaction was another reminder that she'd managed to taint it. Seeing me struggle, our wedding coordinator stepped in and discreetly assigned someone from her team to keep an eye on Clara, ensuring she wouldn't create any more scenes. I was grateful, though I couldn't shake the exhaustion from having to manage my sister's disruptions on what should have been the best day of my life. During the photo shoot, Clara made one last attempt at sabotage. She lingered close, pretending to join in group photos she wasn't invited to. When it was time for Josh and I to take our couple portraits, she kept hovering nearby, attempting to photobomb every shot. The photographer, bless her, gently but firmly asked Clara to step aside. She muttered something under her breath but finally walked away. As the night wound down, I realized Clara hadn't managed to ruin everything, but she definitely put a damper on the day. I decided I couldn't just let her walk away without consequences. This was more than sibling rivalry or petty jealousy. She'd intentionally set out to disrupt and disrespect one of the biggest moments of my life. Watching her sulk off to the side as Josh and I shared our first dance, I felt a sense of resolve growing inside me. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. As we said goodbye to our guests and prepared to head off for the night, I started putting together a plan. I didn't know exactly what I'd do, but I knew one thing for certain: Clara wouldn't be seeing me in the same way again. Update 3. A couple of days after the wedding, I decided to post a simple thank you message on social media. I kept it mostly positive, thanking everyone for coming and for making it a special day. But I ended it with a subtle dig, grateful for those who truly celebrated with us and for the memories made despite a few who had other intentions. It was vague enough to seem harmless to anyone who didn't know the details, but for those who were there, or those who had heard, there was no mistaking who I was talking about. The comments section blew up with friends who had witnessed Clara's behavior. People started sharing stories of what they'd noticed, from her obnoxious speech to her attempted photo bombs. A few even commented directly, saying how embarrassed they'd felt on my behalf. The post gained traction, and it wasn't long before Clara messaged me directly, demanding to know what I was trying to imply. I ignored her message and decided it was time for a more direct approach with the family. I sent a message to the family group chat detailing her stunts at the wedding, from arriving in a nearly identical dress to her jokes during the vows and that mortifying speech. I laid it all out, making it clear that her behavior was unacceptable. My parents jumped to her defense immediately, calling it a misunderstanding and saying Clara probably hadn't realized the effect she was having. But several of my cousins and even my aunts chimed in, saying they'd noticed Clara's odd behavior too and were shocked by it. Clara stayed quiet through the whole thing, but later that night she sent me a long, dramatic message accusing me of ruining her reputation and trying to turn the family against her. She ended by calling me petty and saying that I was exaggerating everything. But support continued to grow on my side. Friends who had seen the whole thing started posting their own takes on social media, standing up for me and sharing bits about how Clara's actions had impacted the day. The more people heard, the less sympathy she seemed to get. I noticed that mutual friends of ours who worked with her started to distance themselves as well. One friend mentioned that Clara's behavior at my wedding had even come up at work in casual conversations, and people were starting to look at her differently. That's when I decided to take it a step further. Clara worked in a field where financial accountability was crucial, and I knew she'd had a few gray areas in her expense reporting. I'd heard enough stories over the years to suspect she'd fudged a few numbers here and there. Anonymously, I tipped off her employer about potential discrepancies. I didn't give specific details, just enough to prompt them to take a closer look. I knew it was drastic, but after everything she'd done, I felt she'd crossed a line. The fallout within the family only grew from there. My parents, of course, continued to defend her, brushing everything off as typical sibling rivalry. But the rest of the family wasn't having it. My cousins and a few aunts openly told me they were horrified by Clara's actions and that they fully supported me. Even Josh's family got involved. His mom called me, expressing her shock and disappointment at Clara's behavior and assuring me that they'd stand by us. It was nice to feel supported, especially after how much Clara had tried to chip away at our relationship. As Clara's reputation continued to unravel, I could see her social circle shrinking. Friends she'd known for years were noticeably pulling away, probably because they saw how extreme her behavior had been. A few people who used to hang out with her regularly stopped inviting her to events, and she soon became the subject of hushed whispers in our friend group. Her carefully crafted image was crumbling. Then, one night, I received a tearful voicemail from Clara. She begged me to forgive her, claiming that she'd never meant to hurt me and was just caught up in things. But there was no acknowledgement of what she'd actually done or any genuine apology. It felt more like she was desperate to patch things up now that the consequences were piling up. I didn't respond. Instead, I decided it was time for a more drastic boundary. I informed my family that I wouldn't be in contact with Clara until she took full accountability for her actions. This wasn't just about the wedding. Her behavior had been toxic for years, overshadowing countless events and achievements. Every milestone I'd had, she'd found a way to undermine. Enough was enough. Extended family members began distancing themselves from her, too, clearly seeing that she wasn't going to admit any wrongdoing. The support I felt from them was a relief, as if they'd finally seen the reality of our relationship for what it was. I wasn't alone in dealing with her toxicity anymore, and that gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. In the end, the decision to cut off contact was liberating. I felt like a weight had been lifted, and for the first time in a long time, I was able to focus on my new marriage without the shadow of her interference. Josh and I settled into our lives, free from her judgment, and my gratitude for those who supported me only grew. To seal things, I decided to take legal action. Clara had spread lies about my character to family and friends and had nearly sabotaged my relationship with Josh. I wasn't going to let her continue this pattern. By putting a restraining order in place, I could prevent any further falsehoods or interference. Now, as I look back, I feel a sense of calm and finality. Clara may not take accountability, but she can no longer take control of my life. And for the first time, I have the freedom to live without her toxic influence. Update 4. After weeks of silence, I finally received an apology letter from Clara. The message was long and carefully worded, describing how she'd reflected on everything that happened. She claimed she hadn't realized how much she'd hurt me and expressed her remorse for overstepping. She even mentioned that losing friendships and facing criticism from family had forced her to take a hard look at her actions. But something about the letter felt off. The way it was worded seemed rehearsed, more like damage control than a genuine apology. She was vague about the specifics, avoiding direct mention of what she'd done at the wedding. Instead, she focused on how difficult it's been for her. It read more like a plea for forgiveness so she could move on rather than her actually acknowledging the hurt she'd caused. Still, I responded. I told her that if she truly wanted to make things right, a public apology was necessary. She'd spread her actions across our entire social circle, tarnishing both my reputation and my wedding day. It only seemed fair she make amends in the same way. After some hesitation, Clara agreed, though it was clear she wasn't thrilled. A few days later, she posted a short apology on social media, taking accountability for some actions that had caused pain. It was half-hearted, but it was a start. With that, I agreed to limited contact, though I made it clear that forgiveness wasn't automatic. Clara was back in my life, but at arm's length. This decision split some of our mutual friends. While many understood my need for boundaries, a few felt that I should move on and fully reconcile. Those who supported Clara began drifting away, choosing sides and ending friendships in subtle ways. The friends who remained were the ones who'd seen her true colors and respected my decision. In a way, this split helped me realize who my real support system was. Meanwhile, Clara's professional life had taken a noticeable hit. Apparently, word of her behavior at the wedding had circulated at her workplace, affecting her reputation. Colleagues she'd once been close to started avoiding her, and a few projects she was supposed to lead were reassigned. It wasn't just whispers anymore. She was facing real consequences for her actions. Some mutual friends working in the same industry confided in me, confirming that her credibility had taken a hit, which only strengthened my resolve to maintain firm boundaries. On my end, I decided to keep up with therapy. It was helping me process not only the recent events but also the years of subtle undermining Clara had done. I hadn't realized how deeply ingrained her influence was until I started unraveling it all. My therapist encouraged me to keep setting boundaries, to recognize that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and to surround myself with people who truly supported me. For the first time, I felt like I was moving forward without constantly looking over my shoulder. Through it all, Josh was a rock. He praised me for standing my ground, for not letting Clara continue to undermine our relationship. We grew stronger as a couple, having weathered the storm together. Our relationship felt renewed, as if we'd survived a test and come out the other side with even more trust and loyalty. Josh reminded me that we didn't need anyone's approval to be happy, least of all someone who couldn't respect us. The friends who stood by me became my true inner circle. Our connections deepened, built on mutual trust and shared experiences. These friends didn't just see me as Clara's sister or the person who always tried to keep the peace. They saw me as someone who'd fought to protect her own happiness. The support they showed through this whole ordeal gave me a new perspective on family, friendship, and self-worth. I finally realized that I didn't owe anyone access to my life if they couldn't respect me. Clara's isolation continued, and as her social circle shrank, she seemed to finally grasp the impact of her actions. Fewer and fewer people reached out to her, and the family who'd once defended her began seeing her in a new light. Some distant relatives, cousins, and even old friends of hers reached out to me, quietly showing their support. It became clear that this wasn't just about one wedding, it was about the pattern of behavior she'd displayed over the years. People were seeing her for who she was, and she was left facing the fallout. Despite everything, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. I'd found out who my true friends were, strengthened my marriage, and learned to set boundaries. I wasn't the same person I'd been before the wedding. Standing up to family toxicity had changed me in the best possible way. I felt lighter, like I was finally living for myself instead of constantly managing other people's expectations. As for Clara, I still hope she learns something from all this. I don't hate her, I just want her to understand that actions have consequences. Maybe one day she'll genuinely reflect on what she did and change for the better. But that's up to her. I've done what I can, and now it's time for her to do the work. From now on, my boundaries stay firm. No more bending over backward to keep the peace, no more second chances without real accountability. I'll be here if she truly wants to mend things, but I won't be dragged down by her drama again. And for the first time, I'm okay with that. I'm finally at peace, ready to move forward with a new outlook on life and relationships, knowing I have the strength to protect my own happiness. Update 5. Not long after I'd started to feel some peace with my life and the boundaries I'd put up, Josh approached me with a final plea. He wanted to make things work, he said, but he still couldn't agree to the backup plan we'd discussed. This backup plan was a protective measure I'd insisted on from the beginning, something that wasn't about a lack of trust, but about ensuring we were both secure, especially after everything that had happened with Clara. Josh couldn't see it that way, though, and felt it went against the commitment he wanted in our marriage. I repeated what I'd said before. The backup plan wasn't negotiable. It wasn't a question of my love for him or our future together, it was a matter of mutual respect and security. But as much as I explained, he continued to view it as a lack of faith in him. The tension was building, and it was clear we weren't seeing eye to eye. We decided to attend a joint counseling session as a last effort to find common ground. During the session, Josh opened up about his deep-seated fears around marriage, admitting he'd always struggled with the concept of lifelong commitment. His concerns didn't seem tied to me specifically, but to his own insecurities about what marriage represented. The counselor gently suggested that his resistance to the backup plan might have more to do with his own fears than with any real issue between us, which shed new light on things for both of us. But even with this understanding, he still couldn't accept it. A few days later, Josh proposed his own alternative idea for our marriage agreement, something he described as more traditional. He suggested we write up a basic agreement about shared values and financial arrangements, but without the protections I'd asked for. He felt this approach would bring more trust into our relationship. But for me, it wasn't enough. I needed the security of the backup plan to protect both of us, and without that, his proposal felt hollow. Realizing how much he was digging in his heels, my own resolve began to solidify even more. This backup plan wasn't just a piece of paper or some precaution, it represented my independence and the lessons I'd learned from my experiences with Clara. For me, it was essential, a symbol that I could still protect my interests while committing to someone. But every time I tried to explain it, Josh saw it as an attack on his integrity. Then his family got involved. His mother and a few relatives reached out to me, some through calls, others subtly through messages. Their words were carefully chosen but hinted at the same thing. If I loved him, I'd meet him halfway. They spoke about compromise as if it were the only way for relationships to succeed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were more interested in me backing down than understanding my perspective. I thanked them politely and moved on, but their comments only added to the pressure. I had a private talk with my parents, sharing my frustrations and explaining everything. To my relief, they were supportive, assuring me that my boundaries were valid and necessary. My mother reminded me that a marriage built on forced compromise wouldn't bring me the peace or security I was looking for, and my father reiterated that respecting oneself should come before anything else. Shortly after, Josh came to me with an ultimatum. He said that if I couldn't let go of the backup plan, he didn't see how we could get married. His words hit like a punch. He genuinely expected me to cave. But I remained calm, accepting his stance. I told him that while I loved him deeply, my security and peace of mind had to come first. The backup plan wasn't negotiable, and if he couldn't accept that, then maybe we weren't meant to be. His expression shifted from shock to hurt, and though I could see he'd expected a different answer, I didn't waver. I walked away from that conversation, heartbroken yet strangely steady in my choice. I felt a mix of grief for the relationship I thought we'd have, and a deep sense of empowerment for standing by my values. The reactions from family and friends were mixed. Some were shocked, unable to understand why I'd stood my ground on something they saw as minor. Others applauded me for setting a boundary, validating my decision to prioritize my needs and security. It became clear that everyone had an opinion, but the only one that mattered was mine. A few days later, Josh reached out again, this time apologetic. He said he hadn't meant to push me away, that he'd acted out of fear of losing me. He asked for one more chance, hoping we could meet in person and talk it out. I agreed, but I knew that my stance wouldn't change. We met, and I calmly explained that while I loved him, the backup plan was essential for my peace of mind and independence. He listened, and I could see he was weighing everything I was saying. In the end, Josh realized he couldn't move past it, and he left, this time for good. We both walked away, accepting that sometimes love alone isn't enough to bridge certain divides. Afterward, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. It hurt to say goodbye to someone I'd envisioned a life with, but at the same time, I found strength in upholding my values. I hadn't compromised on what was important to me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly honoring myself. Now, as I reflect on everything, I'm grateful for the lessons. I learned that standing up for myself, even when it means losing people I care about, is crucial for my happiness. Setting boundaries has become a form of self-love I hadn't truly embraced before. And though this chapter with Josh is closed, I move forward knowing I made the right choice for my future.